From the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., Call on Congress. The program discussing national issues that affect Oklahoma. Your host, U.S. Representative Tom Cole.
Thank you for joining us today for another edition of Cole on Congress. Today we're privileged to have with us as our special guest from the great state of California, Congressman Buck McKeon. Serving his 8th term in the U.S. House of Representatives, Congressman McKeon is a strong conservative voice committed to working towards reform in numerous House policy areas. In particular, Buck is well respected for his work on the Education and Workforce Committee, where he's ranking member, and the Armed Services Committee. Congressman McKeon has championed legislation that will keep higher education opportunities accessible and affordable for millions of students. He's worked towards that goal throughout his position as ranking member of the Education and Labor Committee, and we're honored to have him here today to discuss the status of education in America, Congressman. So it's good to have you on the show.
Good to be with you.
And I have to add that when I was a freshman, you actually came to my district to meet with some of the college administrators out there.
That was great.
You may have been the first congressional leader that I brought to Oklahoma. So, as I recall, you enjoyed the barbecue in Chickasha. You made a point of mentioning that.
I love barbecue, and that was one of the best.
Well, let's start with your own background, because long before you were in Congress, you were interested in education, served on local school boards in California. What experiences did you get doing that is applicable to the drawing of educational policy today that you're so deeply involved in?
Well, I have 6 children, and when our oldest daughter was going into high school, there was a rumor around that, I live in Santa Cruz, which is over the hills from L.A. City, and we were concerned that they were going to be busing our kids down into L.A. City. You don't want your kids to be going too far from home. So there was an opening on the school board, and I ran for it. We had 14 people running, and we were all running against this busing issue. And we'd go to these forums, and we'd have about 20 people in the audience, our best friends, and we'd give these speeches about why we shouldn't have the busing. And I won the election, and at my first school board meeting, I learned that it's against the law to bus from one district to another, so it really was a non-issue. 14 of us running for a seat. We knew nothing about it. And I spent the next 9 years on that school board learning a little bit about education. And I think you asked how does that relate to what I'm doing now? And we get a lot of people talking about things they don't know much about. And I found with No Child Left Behind, as I've traveled around the country meeting with different groups, like when I had the opportunity to come to your district, we were talking about higher ed then, but I've done a lot of traveling, talking to people about No Child Left Behind, and I found that there's a lot of misunderstanding about the law. When it was first passed, actually it's a reauthorization of the Elementary Secondary Education Act that was passed in '65. It wasn't some new law made out of whole cloth. It was the reauthorization of that bill. When that was originally passed in '65, the object was to close the gap between the minorities and the other students, the haves and the have-nots, however way you want to describe it. And since then, we've spent about $80 billion of federal money, which is people's money that comes out of their pockets, goes through the Washington recycling, and comes back to their districts. And there was no close in that gap. $80 billion, and we had a 14% gap that hasn't moved at all. So when President Bush was elected, that was his main goal, was to work on education, improve education, because it's the only way. It's the only way for people to get out of where they are to where they want to be. The only way to get on the ladder to climb and reach the American dream is education. And we were moving too many kids through the system that didn't learn to read, that didn't learn basic math. And so the reauthorization that we called No Child Left Behind actually brought accountability, so that we said, we're not going to keep doing this. We're not going to leave any of these children behind. And at first, human nature is change is not good. But people are understanding now, and they're seeing, and the test scores are up. The gap is closed.
What are some of the things that you did in No Child Left Behind, or we did, obviously, as a country, that you think have made a difference for the good, have helped us begin to narrow that gap?
Accountability. And the way you get accountability is test what you're doing. So we said that the states set their own standards. They pick what tests are going to do. We just said you're going to have standards and you're going to have tests, and we're going to test the kids on math and reading in the 3rd grade and the 8th grade, and we're not going to keep promoting them. We're not going to give them a diploma that they can't read. And so for a while, people resisted and said, we can't do this. We're not going to do this. And finally, they said, well, it's the law. I guess we are going to do it. And they've there's been just a real change. And I've seen people now saying, it really is working. We needed that accountability, because for years we felt good if we were moving most of the kids along, and there were some that were slipping through the cracks, far too many. And so people I've met now all around the country with teachers, principals, superintendents, school board members, parents, and they all really understand that there's some really good things in the law, and it's brought good results, but there's some things that need to be fixed.
And I like all of us, I think, in Congress, I know I've had any number of teachers and administrators coming to visit with me about this reauthorization. It may well be the most important piece of domestic legislation we work on this year in terms of its consequences for the average American and that opportunity you talked about. So what are some of the things, the changes that you think are necessary and that we have a shot of getting into the legislation? And then, frankly, what are some of the disagreements that are shaping up about this legislation?
The basic tenet, accountability, is the big concern I have, that there may be attempts by the unions to weaken that. And then it all is for naught, because the gains that we've made, if we weaken that accountability, and there have been several proposals, then those students that have been given a chance now will again be slipping through the cracks. So that's a big concern I have, is that we don't weaken the basic concept of the bill. Having said that, English is a second language. I know there's some things we need to do there. The special ed kids, some of them have been tested to where they really don't have the capacity. We know that can be fixed through waivers and through little changes in the law. Growth models.
I was going to ask you about that. That's one of the things that it's just for our listeners to understand. Basically, the idea is, we have certain standards we want you to reach. A lot of people may not quite make that standard, but if they started way behind it and they've moved toward it, in other words, they show growth over the course of a year. As I understand it, we didn't really have a good way of measuring that. You either made it or didn't make it. Now there's at least some discussion of factoring in progress and rewarding and recognizing that.
Right. If you take a 3rd grade teacher that got a student that came in at, say, a 1st grade level on their reading or on their math, and they were able to move them up, say, halfway through the 3rd grade, got 2.5 years progress in 1 year, but they didn't quite, at the end of the year, weren't quite up to 3rd grade. Currently, they're being punished, and it should be, they should be rewarded. They've helped kids move 2.5 years in 1 year. So you have to look at where they start and where they finish, and you can look. We have the abilities now. The technology is there to do a much better job of looking at that, where you can actually measure a teacher's progress with a class, and that, I think, is a real step forward, and we need to continue to refine and work on that to bring that into the law.
What are our chances of having a consensus bill here? The bill as originally written was really one of the great bipartisan triumphs. People think the two parties can't work together, and frankly, all too often we don't. But on this one, the initial legislation, you really had people, yourself, you were a senior member on the committee at that time. Our current Republican leader, John Boehner, was the chairman. George Miller, who's the current chairman now, was the ranking Democrat. The president was involved. You actually all collectively hammered out a really important piece of legislation and passed it overwhelmingly. What are the prospects of that happening again during the course of the debate over reauthorization?
We've been working on this now. You know how it works here. The staff, my staff, the committee staff, and the Democrat staffers on the committee have been working for several months now. We've held hearings. I started hearing process last year, and we made a lot of progress. There are still some concerns I had. I had a meeting last week with Secretary Spellings, and then later in the day had a meeting with Chairman Miller, and I'm pretty positive about the hope of getting something done. Now, Chairman Miller's concern the first of the year was if we didn't get it done early, if it became an issue in the presidential campaign, if one or two of those running for the presidency and on the Democratic side came out against it, that would cause real problems for him in getting something through. And that did happen a week ago in the debate. So he has some concerns. We're a little behind on where we wanted to be. We all met, the group you mentioned, met with President and Mrs. Bush.
Pretty unusual to have a First Lady lobbying this legislation.
Yeah. I think it was around January 8th we met in the Oval Office, Senator Kennedy and NZ, Chairman Miller, myself, Secretary Spellings, and President Mrs. Bush, talking about where we are and how we're going to get it done and how important it is. And I know at the time Senator Kennedy said his goal was to have it out by about March. Well, yeah, that has slipped quite a bit, and actually now we're running ahead of the Senate, but we are a little behind. We hope to have a bill out in September, and the goal is to get it done before the end of the year. So I'm hoping that it will be a good bill. If it's a good bill and it keeps the accountability and addresses the concerns that I've heard from all around the country on the issues we mentioned and a few others, then I'll be foursquare behind it, and I'm hopeful that at least half of our Republican members and half of the Democrat members at least are there. Time will tell on that.
It's tough because you really are trying to legislate from the middle on this bill. I think most Americans would always agree accountability is good, high standards are good, measurable progress, so we can see if you've got a problem. It's not a matter of penalizing people. It's simply knowing we've got a problem with either this particular student or this segment of students, and we need to focus the resources and the attention to do it. But as you say, people also don't like to be measured, don't like to be tested, and certainly don't like to be rewarded or penalized on the basis of results sometimes. So.
Yeah, one of the things that has even come up in this is merit pay, because in some areas it's harder to get teachers to go into some areas. It's harder to get teachers in math and science, and we had a hearing that had John Podesta, and I forget the other guy's name, but he's head of the schools in New York. Both of them were in the Clinton administration. Both of them were talking about merit pay, and I'm boy, this is a new world. Things are really turning around, but education should not be a partisan issue. It doesn't matter when these kids come to kindergarten, first grade, or even Head Start before they even get into school. The teachers don't say, "Are you a Republican or Democrat?" That doesn't matter. It's what can we do to help get you an education so that you can become the best citizen, the best American, the kind of person that you have the potential to become. Education is what helps people get there.
When you're looking at, obviously, the kinds of changes you're discussing in our educational system, you by necessity look around the world a little bit about what our competitors are doing, and you're in a unique position as the ranking Republican on Ed and Workforce. How do you see our educational system broadly stacking up with our economic competitors in Europe and Japan and India and China?
If you look at some of the test scores, we do well starting out when the kids first get into school, but as they progress through, get into senior high school, we don't do as well. We're very low in the rankings with many of these countries. I've been hearing from industry leaders for years now, you need to go to China and India and see what's happening there. I've been to Europe and I've talked to leaders in England and in France and Germany. They have centralized systems there. The whole country, everybody studies the same thing in the first grade, second grade. We don't have that. In America, we're unique. We have our K-12 education is run by the states. In fact, we have some real problems sometimes. People think the federal government is getting too much involved, but it's a totally different system. And then within the states, it's decentralized, where we have local elected school boards. And I think that's a good thing, but it's there are some disadvantages. There's some advantages where you can say, okay, we want everybody in the first grade this year to study this, and everybody in the second grade to study this, and when you graduate from high school, you're going to have a diploma, and it's going to mean this. But I understand our system, and I support our system, and served on a school board, and felt like the closest to the people, the government is going to make the decisions that are better for the people there. In my district, I have a large district in California, and I have an area where it's pretty populous, and it's not a downtown LA, it's a suburb of LA, but we have rapidly growing schools, and we can't build schools fast enough. And then I have a northern part of the district where it's very rural. We have a school that was built for 100 kids with about 60 kids attending. We're trying to find kids to fill the schools. We have an academy with 6 or 7 kids in it, So that's one out of the 435 congressional districts with wide variation. And if you're sitting in Washington and trying to pass a law that's going to have effect around the country and not cause damage between the rural and the urban and the suburban areas, it's a tough thing. So you have to have flexibility, and you can have that. You can have accountability, and you can have flexibility, and that's the kind of thing that we're trying to work in this law. But education is exciting to work on. I'm really hopeful we can get this bill passed.
Let me ask you about another program that I get, and I think all members get a lot of discussion about, and that's the IDEA program, or Individuals with Disability Education Act. As you know, in the middle 1970s, the Supreme Court said that we were obligated to provide education for even children with extreme challenges and disabilities. And Congress then passed legislation, didn't guarantee we would fund 40%, but said we would fund up to 40%, which I notice people tend to forget, that we didn't make commitment to go quite all the way. But that's a program where clearly when you've got a child mainlined into a public education system, sometimes the expense is just enormous, particularly on small school districts. I know in my state, it might cost $5,000 a child or $6,000 a child a year on average, but you might have a special needs child that literally is $100,000 to $200,000 expense on the school. Where are we at in trying to make progress toward helping local school districts that have those kind of unique challenges?
As you said, the Congress responded to that Supreme Court decision and passed the Individual Disability Educational Act and said we would provide up to 40% of the funding. When we won the majority in '92, we were up to about 6 or 7%. out of that 40. When that law was originally passed, $2 billion would have provided 40%. We're up now to much more than $2 billion, and we're nowhere near 40%. We have put, President Bush, the Congress, have put more money each year into IDEA, and in fact, we're up now to about, our last year, we were up close to 20%, and had passed a reauthorization, a Reform Act that would help us get to the 40%. Now it'll, the majority's changed. It'll depend on how the funding goes. I'm hopeful that the reforms that we passed will kick in, because this was becoming kind of a growth industry for attorneys. They would find children with some kind of a disability, and they'd walk in with the parents into the principal's or superintendent's office and say, "This is what we want. This is what we need." And as you said, if you get $5,000 or $6,000 from the state for your funding for the children, and it's going to cost $100,000, well, that the only other place that comes after even if we fund the 20% of it, it still leaves a huge unfunded portion, and then they have to take it out of their general fund, which means all of the other education money for all the other children in the district is going to suffer. We had, in one of my little districts up north, we had a case just like you mentioned. One child, they found a program. They lived up in the rural area of northeast California, and they found this program down in Laguna Beach was going to cost $100,000 a year for the mom to live there and send her son to this program. The school district fought it, took it to court, lost, and they had to come up with $100,000. So it just has to come out of other programs for other children. I think that's one of the greatest, prior to doing the No Child Left Behind, was probably one of the greatest crises that we had in K-12 education. The reauthorization that we passed a few years ago, the reform bill, I think will help that. There'll be some negotiation before you go to court and some arbitration, and I think that makes it not as attractive to the attorneys, and more likely the parties will get together and do what's best for the child.
That's good. Well, we don't have a lot of time left, but I want to pull you over to another one of your passions, and that's higher education. I had the good fortune as a freshman to sit on your subcommittee on higher education. I know you spent a great deal of time wrestling with the twin problems of accessibility and affordability for higher ed. So tell me how we're doing in terms of giving kids the opportunity to go, and frankly making sure that they graduate without more debt than they can possibly handle.
It's a real problem, because the cost of higher education for the last 20 plus years has gone up 4 times faster than the rate of inflation. So it's a real burden on parents and on the students. And a few years ago, kids were graduating with a student loan of about $8,000 or $9,000. Now that's approaching $20,000, and it's going up at an ever-increasing pace. We have put a lot more money into Pell Grants. We've put money into other programs to help, but it seems like no matter what we do, the costs keep going up. And I put in a bill, to try to hold those costs down, and I was criticized for price controls and different things.
Not by parents.
No, just by the bureaucracy here. But something really needs to be addressed, and it needs to be the parents, the students, the state government, the federal government, the schools. We all need to come together to really grapple with this. One thing that's changed with the election and the new majority came in, and what they focused on is focusing on the loans. What we should focus on is the cost of the universities. I put in another bill that I think will help, and they have accepted some of that, and that is to bring more transparency, to set up a website with the Department of Education, and all the schools would have to put in what their costs are. So the parents, students can be able to go on the website and make some decisions based on cost. I think the first thing is, kids grow up, they want to go to a certain school. At some point, rationale steps in. You say, well, okay, well, that school is $20,000 a year. It might be out of my bracket. I remember one of the members on the other side said, everybody should be able to go to Princeton. And I says, yeah, everybody should be able to have a Cadillac too, but some of us have to drive Fords or Chevys. It's just a fact of life. Now, there are ways to do it. Like in California, you can go to a community college, which is very inexpensive for the first couple of years, and then transfer. And half of the students in the country take advantage of that. But we're still losing about 48% of young people that don't have the wherewithal to go to college of their choice. And about 40% of them can't get into any college at all. So I think that we really need to focus. Some schools have done a good job of trying to cut their costs, keep their costs down. But when you look at it, there's really nothing driving them to keep their costs down. There's no motivation. We have more students than we have openings. They say, well, this is a competitive business. I said, I come from business. I understand. I used to sell jeans. And if I sold these jeans for $6, you can tell how long ago I started. But if I sold them for $6 and the guy next door was selling them for $5.50, I didn't sell a lot of jeans. I had to lower them down because there were only so many pants being bought, and they could shop for the prices. And education, it's like, say we have 1 million students and we have 1,100,000 seats. Well, until they get to having 1 million students and 900,000 seats, and then they are competing, then there's some reason for them to keep the cost down. It's not that way. So I think the more we can talk about it, put pressure on, try to get people to keep the cost down. I think education is a great investment, and people should do whatever it takes to go, because they'll make a lot more money, they'll have a lot more opportunities and choices through their life, and they'll enjoy life more, get as much education as they can.
Yeah, I know as an old academic, and we're about out of time, but it's very tough for families sometimes to know what real value in education is, because we all have heard of the big names in education, but it's hard to convince them. Sometimes they can just walk around a block and find something that is an incredible bargain, and that in 10 years, after the child is educated, will have been worth every bit as much as the biggest name. I mean, you don't have to put yourselves in debt for the rest of your life to have a good college education in America.
Right on. Right on.
Well, Congressman, we're just about out of time, but I wanted to thank you for coming out today and joining our show. We appreciate your service in the U.S. House of Representatives and to our country. And there's no doubt that Americans are concerned about the future of education. As Congress continues to debate these issues, rest assured I'll be working with you and trying to keep you up to date with information on education reforms that will benefit the students of the 4th District in Oklahoma. Hope you've enjoyed this episode of Cole on Congress. And until next time, this is Tom Cole from our nation's capital. Thank you for joining us.